Well, hello everybody. Welcome into Great Atmosphere here on this Wednesday edition, February 21st, 2024. Just wanted to get started today by doing a little bit of a winter in review thus far in the season. Now, meteorological winter spans from the beginning of December all the way through the end of February, as it's a little bit different than astronomical winter. But in meteorological terms, it's just in quarters between the three distinct months of each season. So for winter, it would be December, January, and February. Not saying that winter conditions are not entirely conducive for the transitional seasons of March and April, or even October and September. It's just those are the primary ones where we like to do all of our climatological reviews. And as such, winter is coming to a close here in a meteorological sense here in the coming week or so. I just wanted to do a quick roundup of what that looks like so far across the country. So we did have a pretty strong El Nino over the course of our winter, and for the most part, we generally verified on that regard. Usually, with El Ninos, we expect a little bit more wet in the southeast. We expect a dry corridor here in the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys. Usually, that extends a little bit more up and into the northeast, but that did not verify this go around. We also get a little bit wetter all throughout the west, which generally did verify, and we're usually average across the upper plains, maybe a little bit drier up here in the Pacific Northwest, but that also generally did not verify specifically in the Cascadian Range due to the pretty crazy amount of atmospheric river events that we had over the western coast. So generally speaking, I would say it's a moderate verification of a general El Nino season in terms of precipitation. We did see it was this is all according to Climate District. So so far this has been the wettest for North Jersey and East Pennsylvania in history, and we are quite exceptionally dry in North Dakota and the UP of Michigan, and oddly enough, West Texas as well. And the Midwest is pretty average, if not more on the dry side. Eastern seaboard, generally speaking, with the exception of probably the North Carolina coastal plain, for the most part, is a generally wet season as well. And then Florida started out quite dry, but over the course of this past 2 or 3 weeks, it's caught up to the mean average, with that subtropical jet just screaming out overhead, causing a lot of problems, has brought it back to a more above average precipitation season. So that's what it looks like from a precip side, but from a temperature side, it shows a much different story. We can generally say that for the Great Lakes states, Michigan, Wisconsin, particularly Wisconsin and Minnesota, this has been the warmest winter on record, and that goes all the way back to 1893. So certainly an interesting little development there. Typically in an El Nino season, we do expect this general region as a whole to go milder, not necessarily hotter, mind you, it's just milder. So we don't expect as much of a pronounced winter season as some might generally expect for winter to have. And then usually, though, it's not so much here that's the more, I would say, aggregate mild. It's usually more of a New England and upstate New York that usually goes more mild, and certainly they did, just not to the most correlative extent that Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan did as a whole. So generally speaking, we do expect mild conditions over in this region of the U.S., but conversely, we normally see pretty much like across, let's say, anything on this side, usually trends cooler, not necessarily cold, but just cooler than normal. And we didn't actually see that this year. It was generally above average even still. So it's quite interesting. El Ninos, they are quite reliant. I kind of like to refer to El Nino as if you were to equate everything to like a recessive gene in like DNA, in genetics in general. So like if a recessive gene is left by itself with no dominant genes in place, then El Nino's teleconnections will generally take over. right? But if another dominant teleconnection, so in this case, like a strong MJO or a PNA or an AAL starts to get a little bit more strong, and those are all specific oscillations that go throughout the course of the temperature profiles of the oceans that dictate the tropics and ultimately moisture transport. Those supersede whatever El Nino condition we would otherwise be expecting in an El Nino year. So I think that happened a couple of times and probably skewed generally the West to be a little bit more moist and a little bit more warm than we would expect in an El Nino year. But particularly the main thing of note is obviously the big breaking news is warmest winter potentially on record for the Great Lakes states, and we can see that reflected in the Great Lakes themselves. I mean, we're at the end of meteorological winter, and we're not even at 10% ice cover for the Great Lakes. Typically, that's well over 40-50% at this point in some regard, and this is depth as well, ice concentration. So generally, this west partition of Lake Huron is usually covered. The northern regions of Superior are usually much more iced over as well. We're just not seeing it this year. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays into effect and how this looks in the summertime, especially if we go into a La Nina dominant winter season next year. It could translate to a very... It's kind of why a lot of meteorologists right now are very wary about the heat this summer, in addition to drought as well. If these lake temperatures and ocean temperatures, specifically in the tropics, they're already at levels of temperature that we would expect them to be in May. So if they're already seeing those temperatures now in February, what is that going to mean for the late summer if they don't have to have all that time to catch up? So things to be mildly concerned about, maybe in the back of your head as you move forward in time. We can also take a look at the national snowfall analysis. This is actually not this year's. I was looking at analogs before. So this is this year's for 2023 into 2024. Pretty low snowfall amount totals across the east, with the exception, obviously, of the northeast and the upper portions of Michigan. The main story is as follows. It's pretty much anywhere points west of the Rocky Mountain Plateau got a significant amount of snowpack via those atmospheric rivers and North Pacific jet extensions that we have been seeing across the west this season. Really, really good in terms of river outflow coming up in the spring, snow melt. Obviously, ski resorts and everything are over a moon at this. Sierra Nevada received, I think, 34. Well over. You can see these values. You can definitely see up into the Cascadian range as well, 30, 40 feet. I know Mount Rainier got up to 50 feet. I mean, that's pretty incredible. But then conversely, you see since we had so much flow going directly up and in like this, conversely, we didn't have a lot of flow coming out on the outset. We see some of that line coming across the plains. That's just generalized flow right there. And then that easterly flow as it continues kind of piddled out a little bit. Got a lot of warm air that inserted itself into the Midwest. And then we had some westward facing slopes in the Alleghenies got hit pretty hard. And then we have our typical lake effect off of Erie and Ontario that affected New England, in addition to those of Michigan and Superior and the UP of Michigan and otherwise. But generally in the southeast, it's relatively snow-free. Pretty much the Virginia coastal plain down through the Carolinas, through Georgia, Alabama, with the exception of the northern tier of the deep southern states. Generally snow-free. And I know, I know living here in Charlotte, this is looking like it's going to be another year without winter, or another year without snow, mind you. Weird to kind of put that together. I mean, like, you would think, oh, well, you live in the southeast, you can't expect snow all the time. Well, it turns out you can. Since the records have been shown, I mean, there hasn't been 2 consecutive years of a snowless winter in Charlotte since records have been happening. So, which traces back to the 1890s. So, quite odd. I mean, and it's like we're not expecting huge snowfall totals, and this is talking like a trace. So it's like we didn't even receive a trace here in Charlotte. for so far this year in the 23-24 season, nor did we in the 2022 to 2023 season. The last snow that we had cumulative here was in the 21 to 2022 season, when we got about 3 inches, and that was in January. But we can take a look at it. We can look at El Nino correlations with this map as well. Last El Nino, major El Nino to take place would be, I believe that was 2016. So we can take a look at the 16-17 map. And you know what? It's generally correlative, right? I mean, we have a Darth in the Midwest, big values, really big values in the West. We have our lake effect in the Northeast. And then, generally speaking, in those same regions, with the exception of some dustings across the deep south, and more into the Carolinas, we had about, what does that look like, 6 inches to a foot. So that main line kind of extended maybe about 50 kilometers further south. But generally speaking, very similar. And then the next El Nino I can remember back being would be, I think it was the 2010-9 season. Maybe that's probably not it if we're looking at correlations. 2010. You see, that's what I'm talking about, though. I mean, like, there was probably a different teleconnection that was more dominant in place for the El Nino for the 2009-2010 season, and we got a lot more snow that time. And the climate has obviously been changing since then. So just something to keep in mind. And it's never good when we don't get snow here in the Southeast. I mean, that's part of the fun, kind of going into the apocalypse that kind of takes place. It's all good fun now. I think people for the most part have kind of embraced the fact that no one knows how to drive in the snow, and obviously that's dangerous. Don't want to say don't be good at driving in winter conditions by any means, but people kind of embrace that down here. So it's sad when we don't see it. So taking a look, we'll transition real quick from there and look into our current conditions. Generally speaking, quite calm conditions across the whole of the U.S. at the moment. The atmospheric river has died down over the west. We still have a low spinning off of the Olympic Mountain coastline in Washington. That'll be the major player that comes and creates a little bit more trouble for us as we progress into the end of the week. But we have high pressure that's dominant overhead across the southeast. And then with that high pressure, it's starting to open up the Gulf just a little bit. You can see that surface level flow starting to make its way through the Mississippi Valley. And as that interacts with upper level flow and interacts with more cold air coming in from the plains, we start to see some showers and storms start to convect a little bit in northern Illinois and Indiana. But generally speaking, not a lot else to report. We can take a look at current temperatures. Quite toasty right now, quite mild. We have 60s, mid 60s all throughout the course of the, and this is as of 2 p.m. Central, 3 p.m. Eastern. So mid 60s all throughout, up and into Nebraska, even 60s here in Detroit. Then we have 70s, West Texas. West Texas particularly is quite hot right now, and it's been hot for the past few days. Mid 70s over the whole of Texas and Oklahoma, and then high 60s, mid 70s, and then actually in the Carolinas, just because we still have that remnant low that is making its way, kind of advecting cold air on the back end. Still pretty chilly across the majority of the mid-Atlantic and into the Northeast. All hazards map showing not a lot. Main feature of note here would obviously be the red flag warnings that are here in New Mexico, southeastern Colorado, and West Texas. Generally, and we'll just do a quick fire weather in review. Wildfires in general need 3 main things in order for them to generate. They need high winds, they need a fuel source, so they need something to burn, obviously, and they need things that are not wet to burn. And then you need low dew points. You need low humidity. So the air itself does not have a lot of moisture to tamp down any particular thing that might come its way. And we can see in the fire weather warning put out by the Albuquerque office, we see widespread critical fire conditions anticipated due to low relative humidity. High pressure breaking down causes strong southwest winds, 50 miles an hour gusts. That's quite significant. And fuel moisture remains a limiting factor after incredibly dry conditions yesterday. Moisture depleting west-southwest winds did dictate the red flag warning. And I would agree that the fuel moisture is the limiting factor, simply because, well, it's wintertime. There's simply not a lot of vegetation on the ground in general. But I don't know if it's going to... We can take a look actually back and see what it looks like. This is what the past 3 specific weeks have looked like across the U.S. It's an interesting map as well. I mean, technically, the past 3 weeks, it's been the driest it's been in the Finger Lakes areas of New York and into eastern Ohio and the Midwest, particularly down into the Mid-Atlantic and the Carolinas. It's been quite dry as well, but and particularly looking at the areas of West Texas and southeastern New Mexico, generally dry. But in the climate district of Colorado, on the other hand, it's been quite wet. And one of the things, especially in a transitional season like spring, you never know when those buds are starting to come out, and those leaves are starting to make their way out as well. That's all going to be fuel for the fire, specifically if you have a recent drought, like if it hasn't rained in about 2 or 3 weeks, for particular vegetation that is susceptible to or needing a high moisture source in a consistent amount of time. Like those things play into it. But definitely in terms of fuel moisture, that would be the limiting factor based off the climatological conditions that we've seen over the past few weeks there. But certainly we can take a look at, like, so here's temperatures, surface temperatures, quite elevated, obviously, in that particular region of the U.S. And then we can take a surface dew points. I mean, these dew points are kind of ridiculous. So 13, 11 degrees Fahrenheit, those 2 degrees Fahrenheit dew points. Those are that's exceptionally dry. That's cracking your lips and making your skin completely crinkle type of dryness. There's no moisture at all in that profile. So definitely in those regards, they got those things covered. But yeah, so definitely something to be concerned about in terms of fire weather in those areas. This is definitely more of a prescribed burn type of time, I would say, for the U.S., specifically more across the Southeast. This is when a lot of fire departments and local NPS areas like to kind of do their prescribed burns during this time of year due to the conditions that are out there. But for that particular region in New Mexico and Texas, areas need to be on the lookout. And I only pretty much highlight that just because there's not a lot else going on. But we do have another system that is making its way over into our neck of the woods in the Southeast coming up in the next few days. And it'll be mainly a Thursday night into Friday night period. We can see as we move forward with the NAM 3 kilometer, we can see with high pressure that is sitting off or near the Carolinas coast. Yep, right there, it starts to do this kind of flow motion right here, opens up the Gulf, bringing in a lot of Gulf moisture here, and then we'll have our typical panhandle low that will start to form and then kind of dip and then do its normal track up and into the Ohio River Valley. That will be our next little troublemaker, and that has been very typical for the pattern that we've had for the past few months. And this one is not going to have a lot of moisture associated with it, just because you can see that the high pressure is not that entirely strong as we make our way towards the end of the week. In addition to that, low is not as strong either, so there's just not a lot of forcing associated with it. But it will bring, as the low makes its way across the Appalachians and starts to move off of the East Coast, it will bring a lot of cold air on the back end. So it will not be a major... So there is a chance for some winter precipitation in the upstate of New York, New England, and central PA. But ultimately not something for the coast or I-95 corridor to be concerned about. And even still, I mean, this is going to be a very quick-moving storm system this is 11 o'clock Thursday, 3 a.m. into Friday. And by the time we get into the mid-afternoon on Friday, the whole thing starts to ship out, and we are left with even more pleasant weather going into the weekend. But and we can take a look at that moisture transport, or we can take a look at, this is moisture dew points, so we can see that we have dew points that go up to 37, 39 degrees, all the way up and into Michigan, and this is going to be, I would say, kind of the problem area for any kind of convective initiation that occurs over the course of Thursday, Friday. That's probably where the frontogenesis will make its way as that interaction between cold air from the central plains starts to make its way into this big gradient that we're seeing right there. In addition to that, we can take a look at kind of our next big system that we're anticipating. We've talked about what the models have been looking like in terms of the polar jet max that is starting to appear in a lot of our ensemble guidance So this is the Euro's 500 millibar height anomaly map. The thing that's been missing, particularly in this winter season, is a polar jet. We have been dominated by the subtropical jet for the most part of our season, so we've had a lot of moisture coming in from the Hawaiian archipelago and up and in, and then and that's been the primary jet response pretty much the entire length of the Pacific Ocean. And it's generally speaking, anything polar has been caught up here in the polar vortex. The polar vortex has been largely very strong for the most part, with the exception of a January cold snap and I believe a late November cold snap as well, where the cold air from the Arctic escaped. Right now, the cold air is currently centered over Siberia, does not seem to be wanting to move all that much anymore, just because a specific tropical teleconnection is not wanting to disturb it by any means. Particularly the MJO is quite neutral at the moment. Generally speaking, that is what has been that's been the story. And it's not necessarily going to change in terms of the polar vortex, but the main thing that is changing as we move into our transitional springtime months will be the addition of a polar vortex, as the El Nino is scheduled to become a lot more, scheduled to weaken quite considerably as we move into the summer months. So we see the polar jet that is denoted here by this disparity between a troughing that's occurring here over the Bering Strait, and then ridging that is inserting itself over into the Aleutian Islands. That disparity right there signals the polar jet, and then we see kind of wherever those isobars start to make its way is where we would expect cold air to start inserting itself. So this is on Friday 18Z, and then we start to move forward bit by bit, and interestingly, we do have a low that sits off of the California coast, which should start to bring in, if there was more disparity in terms of if there was like a max right here, and in terms of a ridge that was interacting with that low, I would say that this would be another major atmospheric river event from the subtropical regions, but it doesn't look to be that particularly strong in a gradient, so I wouldn't expect much out of it. The main story will definitely be, there we go. Love pivotal. The main story will definitely be where that polar jet max starts to make its way, and this is interesting, right? So we see that the polar jet and the subtropical jet, for the most part, start to kind of do a little do-si-do with each other. We see the polar jet starts to kind of go in this direction, and then we have lift from the subtropics, and they meet here, right? And then from that point on, we get southwest flow. Now, if you know anything about springtime weather, we have the main thing that causes severe thunderstorms here in the eastern seaboard of the United States, and I mean, or probably should say eastern half of the United States, including the plains, is when we have troughs here and we have high pressure over the southeast, because that just creates a southwesterly flow like that. And the more that these troughs dig in to the south, and the more meridional their flows patterns are, that just means like the more cold and dry air is forced down into the warm and moist subtropical air mass. That's where we get some serious severe weather that we typically do expect, obviously, in the transitional months of March and April. So this is a very spring-like connection. It's not the end of winter, I will say, because those troughs, they can dip down successively, and they can get quite, depending on the forcing that's behind them and around them, they can get quite virulent. So it's, they're, and in fact, the major Texas cold snap that completely crippled ERCOT a few years ago was in this same kind of realm, where it just had a very, we had high pressure over the southeast, and there was just a low that dipped all the way down into Texas, and it had a successive round behind it, and that created a pretty snowy event there. Not saying it's impossible, it's improbable based off what we're currently looking at in terms of, we have ridging over next to Greenland, and then we have more ridging in Alaska after that, but not impossible by any means. So that is generally a good setup for severe weather. We can move it forward a little bit further in time. That's a little bit too far, excuse me. So this everyone is kind of worried about this time frame right here. We get a pretty significant disparity. We see polar jet making its way down, even a little shortwave right there in the mid-levels, disparity on the way out and into the Great Lakes regions. So this is the area, this is where we would expect the jet to be, left exit region, and points due south, and pretty much anywhere actually with difluent flow aloft. We would expect to see some level of a QLCS squall to form there. Pretty high wind event. If I had to take a shot at it, we can see this reflected in the flagship models as well. This is, let's go back just a little bit of time. 6 a.m. Tuesday. Let's go back a little bit further. So we see the cold air start to dip in from the Dakotas, so you can see that it is cold air based off of the amount of snow that we are expecting over the Mountain West as we go forward there. And we'll move forward just bit by bit to see when this convective initiation begins. So according to, I'm going to pay more attention to what the Euro is doing compared to the GFS. GFS will just kind of see where the confidence level is associated with it in terms of timing. So this would be midnight on Wednesday. And then we'll go a little bit. Say, earlier they were saying that this would be more of a Tuesday event. Seems to be like both of the main models have kind of shifted this to be a little bit more delayed in its approach. So this would be noon on Wednesday, and then the GFS opens it up quite significantly. But the Euro has it a little bit more north, and you can see, and this is a concern, I would say. I mean, we have a very meridional flow here with the Euro, which could lead to a quite significant squall line effect. Create a lot of perhaps discrete initiation out ahead of it as well, depending on a number of different wind shear factors, but that's all stuff that we'll have to take a look at as we get closer to the event itself. And then we see meridional flow closes off quite well over the Great Lakes, according to the Euro, and then ultimately, once it makes that occlusion, we have that main cold line front start to make its way. Be interested to see how close together those isobars are. We can take a look at what the Euro is expecting in terms of pressure at the mean surface level pressure. Let's take a look here. So we do see the low start to dip in, and as that low dips in, it'll bring in cold air kind of like this and pinch. And you can see those tight isobars. This would kind of be the beginning. This is where we would see the majority of the straight line wind gusts in that particular region. We'll coax it ahead just a little bit here. And yeah, so wow, 994, 992, it's 990 is what the Euro is saying at this point as it deepens in. And we can see that 540 line dipping all the way down and into Texas. We'll see as we go into the night if that dips down any further. It doesn't seem to be the case, but this is your classic little, this is your classic transitional springtime month kind of system. Those isobars are very well packed in together, so it's definitely going to be a wind event, whatever it might be. Can't really say much about a tornado or hail at this point. Need a little bit more information in terms of particular dynamics as we get closer. This is already obviously a week out, but certainly it looks like it's pushed back from Tuesday night and pushed in more to a Wednesday afternoon kind of look-see at the moment. Things could change. This is just the current 12Z model run. I know at the 0Z run it was predicting a 12-hour difference right there, but this is definitely going to be, I'd say, the first big springtime event. And then depending on how typically in these types of setups where we have this this southwest flow coming out of, and if this kind of stays in place here, it'll kind of keep regenerating on itself over and over. And as long as this polar jet stays in place, and we obviously still have a strong El Nino teleconnection as well coming in from the subtropics, this is kind of like one of those 5 to 7 days. Every 5 to 7 days we'll get some kind of severe threat somewhere, depending on where these trough axes appear in the Midwest, in the Central Plains, or points due east. And then in terms of temperature outlooks as well, you can kind of see that reflected pretty well here in the 8 to 14 day as we begin March, well above average temperatures in the east and well below average temperatures. I shouldn't say well below. This is a confidence interval, so high chances of above average temperatures in the east, high chances of below average temperatures in the west, and that is particularly indicative based off of our trough ridge pattern. We have our low here, we have our high here. High pressure aloft brings in the air like this. Low pressure does the same thing as it brings in air in this kind of pattern. and then obviously on the back end brings in more cold air behind it, and the end result is a big zone. That's a very, I wouldn't expect a lot of severe weather over the Mountain West by any means. So I'm not indicating that. I'm just saying as the two air masses collide and where those interactions take place is obviously where we'd expect the most convective initiation to begin as you move forward. And then as far as temperatures are concerned over the next 5 days, we can see as that low makes its way off of the coast, generally below average conditions across the eastern seaboard, particularly Florida. But then we have high pressure building in, putting us in the 60s, mid 80s across Texas. But then we begin to see the pattern change start to come into fruition as we see that main system that we're expecting across the Midwest push its way over, bring us down to more mild and climatological conditions as we move forward into the weekend, before things really start to heat back up. And obviously as that low would sit across here, it would bring in cold air. This is why the New England is facing a little bit of a wintry threat this weekend. But on the back end of that, we have high pressure building in across the plains, which will really bring some quite significantly unseasonably warm temperatures. Look at that. That's quite incredible. Before we see our main troublemaker start to make its way in on midday on Tuesday, that will start to kick off our big severe threat starting next week. But man, look at that. It's going to be a very warm and pleasant weekend, I will say, across the majority of the states. Not a lot to be concerned about in terms of and weather. And man, if you were to tell anybody who lives in Des Moines that you're going to be seeing 70, 72 degrees, this weekend in mid-February, I'm sure they'd be overjoyed, but I'm sure they'd also be wanting to get the plan as well. So, interesting setups all around, but that's all I got for you today. Once again, my name is Zach for A Great Atmosphere. I would appreciate your subscription to the channel if you're so much interested. I'll be doing videos like this in this kind of format, primarily focused on the Southeast, just because that's where I've had the most experience, and that's just generally where I want to be the best at forecasting, obviously based off my own local interest. But if there's nothing else going on, and there's interesting stuff going on not only around the country but around the globe, I'll definitely kind of look at that and see what we could find out, just for curiosity's sake. So once again, Zach for Great Atmosphere. I'll be back with another video on Friday. I hope you tune in then. Take care.